AITA for refusing to pay for my boyfriend's food and his birthday and getting him banned from a restaurant. I 18 female have been dating my boyfriend, John 20 male for just under a year. Overall, I'd say our relationship has been pretty solid, healthy communication, mutual respect, no major arguments or toxicity. We have different tastes and backgrounds, sure, but nothing too dramatic except for one particular issue that keeps cropping up, my being vegetarian. I've been vegetarian since I was 11. It's not a dietary preference or a phase, I have very deeply rooted moral and ethical beliefs around it. I don't eat meat, I don't buy meat. That includes not spending my money on meat for other people, even if they're close to me. It's a boundary I've held firm for years, and I've always been upfront about it with anyone in my life. John has known about this from the start. It's not something I sprung on him. In fact, on one of our very first dates, I explained how I'd made a promise to myself when I started earning money that I'd never spend a cent of it on meat. I'm not preachy about it. I don't try to convert people or shame them, I just set a line for myself and stick to it. John always said he respected that, even if he didn't really understand it. But over time, it's become clear that while he might say he respects it, he actually has quite a bit of resentment over it. The issue usually comes up when we go out to eat. We normally split the bill, or sometimes he pays if I covered the cost of an activity like a concert or festival. For example, I once spent over 120 euros on concert tickets for the two of us, his favorite band, by the way, and he picked up a 50 euro dinner bill, and somehow still brought it up later as if we'd gone 50-50. I never made a fuss because I'm not keeping score in that way, but he definitely seems to. Another thing, I've told him many times that I'm happy to pay for dinner for both of us if he orders a meat-free meal. He never does. Even when he says he wants to compromise, it's always me giving ground. He refuses to even consider ordering vegetarian once in a while. So I stick to my rule and pay for myself, and he pays for his food, including the meat. Anyway, a few days ago it was John's birthday, and I made a reservation at this really nice, fancy restaurant he's always talking about. It's a place he's loved for years and goes to with his family sometimes. I wanted to do something special for him, so I booked us a table and made sure to arrange the night so it would be all about him. I drove us there, or something he loves, brought a little gift, the whole deal. Once we were there, we got seated and started looking through the menu. He immediately zeroed in on the most expensive steak they offered. I didn't say anything because again, it was his birthday, and I didn't want to kill the vibe. I just mentally noted that I would be paying for my own food and maybe a shared item like wine or a salad. I ordered a vegetarian risotto and we also got a bottle of wine and a side salad to share. The dinner went well enough. We chatted, laughed, clinked glasses. But the whole time, I could tell he was a little smug, like he had some kind of secret. When the bill came, I flagged down the waiter and asked for it to be split. That's when John's whole mood shifted. He looked at me like I just slapped him. He asked if I was joking. I said no, and reminded him, gently, that I have always been clear about my rule. I told him I'd cover the wine and the salad, but not the steak. He looked stunned. Then he started saying he assumed I would pay for the whole thing because it was his birthday. I asked him why he thought I'd pay for meat when I've never done it before, and he couldn't give me an answer beyond, well, it's my birthday. That was it. No consideration for my boundaries, no acknowledgement that I've never paid for meat, not even on his behalf, and not even when pressured. Just entitlement. He got really quiet and tense after that, and said he needed to use the bathroom. I figured he needed a moment, so I paid for my part of the bill, the risotto, the wine, and the shared salad, and waited. And waited. I sat there for 20 minutes. The waiter even came over to ask if everything was all right. I told him my boyfriend had stepped out but was coming back to settle the rest of the bill. Eventually, I got up and went outside, and found John sitting on a bench a little ways away near the parking lot. I walked up to him and asked why he left. He looked at me, completely confused, and asked if I had not paid for the whole bill. I told him again that I paid for everything except the steak and that he still needed to pay for it. That's when he completely lost it. He started yelling at me on the sidewalk, saying I was selfish and immature, and that I had embarrassed him. I stayed calm and told him this was not new information, he knew about my boundary, and it was not fair for him to expect me to just abandon it because it was his birthday. I told him he needed to go back and pay. He scoffed and turned away, walking off down the street. So I left. I got in the car and drove home alone. I was frustrated and hurt, but mostly just exhausted by the whole situation. Now, a few days later, John is still angry. He says it's my fault that he dined and ditched, and that he's too embarrassed to ever go back to that restaurant again. It's a small, family-owned place where they recognize regulars, so yeah, there's a very good chance they'll remember him. But he is acting like I somehow set him up or sabotaged him, when all I did was stick to a boundary I've been incredibly clear about from day one. He keeps calling me selfish. He says I ruined his birthday. He says no normal girlfriend would do what I did. But I can't wrap my head around why he thought it was okay to expect me to suddenly compromise my morals, especially without even asking me first, and then storm off and leave me to clean up the mess when I didn't. So am I the bad guy here? Or was I right to hold my ground? Update 1. A little more than 2 days had passed since John's birthday, and during that time, things between us were quiet. Uncomfortably quiet. There were a few short messages here and there, mostly about mundane things, and always clipped, sterile. A strained phone call one evening where we talked in circles, both trying to pretend things were fine while clearly dancing around what had happened. The energy was heavy. Every time his name popped up on my phone, my stomach would twist a little. It was as if this invisible wall had gone up between us, one built out of disappointment, defensiveness, and a rapidly deteriorating sense of trust. I found myself thinking, maybe this is it. Maybe this is how we end. And surprisingly, I wasn't devastated. I was sad, sure, but also strangely at peace with the idea. I'd started to accept that our values were just fundamentally misaligned, and while love is important, so is respect. I was getting tired of explaining the same boundary over and over only to be made to feel like it was unreasonable or childish. I don't think he ever saw how much emotional labor it took to keep standing firm in the face of someone I cared about acting like my morals were optional. Then, out of nowhere, one evening I got a message from John, I want to make amends. Let's go to that restaurant again and make the evening right. I'll be honest, I was a little moved when I saw that. It felt like the first real sign of reflection from him. I thought, maybe he had finally sat with what happened and realized he'd crossed a line. Maybe he was ready to come back to the table, not just literally, but emotionally, and show that he could really try to understand me, not just tolerate me when it was convenient. I wanted to believe that. I really, really did. So I agreed. We drove there together. The car ride was surprisingly normal. No tension, no awkward silences, no passive-aggressive comments. It felt like old times, almost. He was relaxed, he played a playlist we both loved, he even reached over and squeezed my hand at one point. I could feel myself softening. I started to think that maybe this wouldn't be a breakup dinner after all. When we arrived at the restaurant, the ambience was warm and familiar. The staff didn't mention the last incident, though I did notice the server gave John a lingering look when we were seated. John, for his part, seemed to have put on his best behavior. He was attentive, asking about my week, cracking little jokes, reminiscing about some of the first dates we'd had together. He brought up the time we got caught in the rain after a festival and laughed so hard we could barely breathe. It was like he had stepped into a version of himself I hadn't seen in a long time. And for a moment, I allowed myself to believe this really was a turning point. We ordered our food. I went with a mushroom risotto again, and he, predictably, ordered another steak. I didn't comment on it. I had made peace with the fact that he would do what he wanted to do, but that didn't mean I had to compromise on what I was comfortable supporting. The meal itself was quiet, but in a cozy, intimate way. It felt like we were finding our rhythm again. I was still cautious, but part of me felt hopeful. Hopeful that this was the start of him finally accepting me fully. And then, the bill came. The waiter placed the leather-bound folder on the table with a polite smile and walked off. I hadn't reached for it yet. I was sipping the last of my wine and thinking about how to express that I appreciated the gesture of trying to make things right. But before I could say anything, John leaned in slightly, that same easy smile on his face, and said in a tone so casual it took me a second to register it, "Well, you said you wanted to make up for that night. It would be nice of you to pay this time." And just like that, the entire illusion shattered. It felt like getting hit with something heavy and blunt, emotionally jarring, not because of what he said, but because of how calculated it was. This wasn't him owning up to anything. This wasn't about growth or understanding. This was manipulation in its softest, most insidious form. The kind that shows up dressed like romance but is really just another push to get what he wants. He hadn't apologized. Not once. Not on the night of his birthday. Not in the days afterward. Not in the car. Not in the restaurant. And now, he was framing this entire evening, not as a way to reconnect or rebuild trust, but as a setup to guilt me into doing the very thing I've always said I wouldn't do. I took a deep breath and sat back in my chair. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I just quietly and calmly told him, once again, that my boundaries haven't changed. That I would cover my meal, the wine, and the salad, but I would not be paying for his steak. I reminded him that this wasn't new. This was a line I've held from the beginning. I didn't shame him. I didn't moralize. I simply stated a fact. And in an instant, the warmth drained from his face. He shut down completely. His smile vanished, and he barely spoke another word for the rest of the night. On the drive home, he turned toward the window, scrolling through his phone, not even pretending to engage. The air in the car was thick with disappointment, but not mine. I was past disappointment. I was sitting in something quieter, something colder. A kind of final clarity. He had never intended to make amends. He wanted to win. And I understood this conversation ahead of time. Update 2. A few weeks passed after that failed, corrective dinner at the fancy restaurant, the one where John, with a smile that felt more like a smirk in hindsight, tried to guilt me into paying for his steak under the pretense of reconciliation. After that night, we didn't talk much. The dynamic had shifted. We weren't broken up, not officially, but the energy between us had grown cool and distant, like something essential had quietly unraveled and neither of us wanted to look directly at the thread that had snapped. Despite the tension, we still kept in touch. A few texts here and there, mostly neutral. No major confrontations. I think we were both waiting for something to change, or more honestly, for the other person to change. It was this silent standoff dressed in politeness. And then, out of the blue, John messaged me again. He asked if I wanted to go out for dinner. This time, he suggested a new gastropub that had just opened on the edge of town. He said he'd heard good things about it and wanted to try their venison burger. But what caught me off guard was how he framed the invitation. He said it wasn't about the food, he just missed spending time with me, that he really valued being with me regardless of what was on our plates. That he wanted to reconnect. It felt like a new tone from him. Calmer. More respectful. He sounded more grounded than before, less defensive. I thought, perhaps we'd reached some kind of turning point, some moment where we could learn to coexist with our differences and find new ways to support one another. I reminded myself of the good moments, the early days of the relationship when things felt easy, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. We met at the gastropub on a Saturday evening. The place was lively but not chaotic, with dim lighting and wood-paneled walls that gave it a cozy, rustic atmosphere. John arrived right on time. He looked relaxed, dressed nicely, and greeted me with a warm, if slightly careful, smile. I could tell he was trying to keep the energy light and positive. Throughout the dinner, he was attentive but not overly so, restrained in a way that suggested he didn't want to push too hard. He asked about my week, shared a few things about his work, and even joked a bit about how he wasn't going to order anything controversial. It felt like a good sign. And then, as expected, he ordered the most expensive meat burger on the menu, their signature venison burger with truffle aioli and a side of gourmet fries. He also ordered one of their handcrafted cocktails, something fancy with aged whiskey and smoked citrus. I didn't say a word. I just ordered the vegetable curry and a lemonade and reminded myself that I had made peace with his choices, as long as they didn't infringe on mine. The dinner was fine. Conversation wasn't as fluid as it had once been, but it was at least civil. The food arrived, we ate, and there was a general air of, let's not ruin this, between us. I was careful not to read too much into it. I didn't want to project my hopes onto someone who had already shown me what he was capable of when things didn't go his way. But part of me wanted to believe that this time would be different. Then the bill came. It was almost theatrical the way he picked it up and looked at it for a moment before sliding it toward me. He gave this light, almost joking tone and said, "Well, since I invited you, you also want to support me, right?" And just like that, all of the progress I thought we'd made evaporated. The warmth drained out of my chest and was replaced by a heavy, dull weight of disappointment. It was the same script again, just a different setting, different words, but the same underlying expectation. That I would fold. That I would abandon my principles under the pressure of appearing supportive or fair. That love should mean moral compromise. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I had done that too many times already. I simply said I would pay for my meal, nothing more. This time, he didn't lash out. There was no scene, no angry walkout or sarcastic remark. He just went cold. Like someone had flipped a switch inside him. The rest of the evening passed in silence. We walked to the car wordlessly. On the drive home, he stared out the window, scrolling through his phone, disengaged, distant. I kept my hands on the wheel, eyes forward, and said nothing. The silence in the car was thick and absolute. The next morning, it began. My phone lit up with messages from him, not overtly angry, but laced with sarcasm and passive aggression. He said things like, "I guess we're splitting everything down to the gram now, and love isn't a transaction, you know. Some people think it's normal to treat your partner once in a while." He didn't say it directly, but the implication was crystal clear. He felt unloved, unsupported, and slighted because I wouldn't pay for his meat. Again. I didn't respond right away. I needed time to process. I reread the messages, trying to find some sign that he was open to understanding, to actually engaging with the root of the issue, but it wasn't there. All I saw was someone who continued to interpret love as transactional only when it benefited him, someone who equated support with obedience, someone who refused to recognize that principles, especially the kind tied to ethics and identity, are not negotiable tokens to be bartered away for the sake of his comfort. And that was the moment it hit me, not in a dramatic or crushing way, but with a quiet certainty. We had reached the end of the road where compromise was still possible. His idea of support meant bending to his expectations, and mine meant respecting boundaries, even when they were inconvenient. These weren't just quirks or personality differences. These were foundational mismatches. And I seriously started thinking about whether this couple has a future at all. Update 3. After what happened at the gastropub, I reached a point where I couldn't pretend everything was fine anymore. The passive-aggressive messages the next day confirmed it. This wasn't just about dinner, or who paid for what. It wasn't even really about meat, at its core. It was about respect, values, and the growing feeling that we were no longer speaking the same emotional language. Avoiding conflict clearly hadn't worked. Silence had only made things fester, and half-hearted attempts at reconciliation had turned into quiet battlegrounds. I realized that if we were going to continue at all, we needed to strip everything down to the raw truth. No more subtle hints, no more hoping things would just naturally improve. So I messaged John and told him we needed to talk. Not about the latest restaurant, not about who invited whom, and definitely not about splitting checks, but about where we were going as a couple. About respect. About values. About whether there was actually a future here. We agreed to meet in the park. It was a quiet spot we both liked, not far from where we first kissed, ironically. There were no distractions, no clinking cutlery, no waiters hovering nearby, no menu between us to symbolize all the things we couldn't seem to agree on. Just a few benches scattered under tall trees and the occasional jogger passing by. The air was crisp, the kind that makes you feel like you're standing at the edge of something important. When we sat down, I didn't ease into it with small talk. I didn't try to sugarcoat it. I looked him in the eyes and told him, calmly and clearly, that I was not hurt by the fact that he ate meat. I had never asked him to stop. What I was hurt by was the repeated attempts to cross my boundary, to wear me down, to frame my principles as selfishness or immaturity. I explained, again, that this had nothing to do with money. That it was not about greed or stubbornness. It was about integrity. That I had made a promise to myself long ago and that every time I was pushed to break it, it felt like I was being asked to chip away at something deeply personal. I told him that if he truly could not accept this part of who I was, then we were probably not on the same path, and it would be better to acknowledge that now than to drag each other through resentment later. What surprised me most was that he didn't get defensive. He didn't start listing all the times he thought he had been fair, or bring up who paid for what. He just sat there in silence for a long moment, staring at the ground. Then, in a quiet voice, he said he had genuinely thought I was exaggerating. That he assumed, like most people, that principles had limits, especially in relationships. That if someone cared enough, they'd make exceptions. But then he said he realized something else, that I had always been consistent. That I never wavered, not once, not even when he got upset or walked away or made it uncomfortable. And for the first time, he saw that not as stubbornness, but as a kind of strength. He said maybe real respect wasn't about getting someone to bend, but choosing not to apply pressure in the first place. What followed was one of the most honest conversations we'd had since we started dating. He admitted that, deep down, he had taken my refusal to pay for his meals personally. That it made him feel less loved, less important, like he wasn't worth making an exception for. I told him that love, for me, wasn't about exceptions that hurt, it was about holding space for someone else's truth, even when it was inconvenient. That I never asked him to stop eating meat, never tried to control him, only asked for my own boundary to be respected. There were no raised voices. No tears. No attempts to one-up or guilt-trip each other. Just two people finally laying out the parts of themselves they'd been hiding under defensiveness and miscommunication. We talked for a long time, until the sun started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the grass. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel exhausted or cornered. I felt understood. By the end of that conversation, we didn't come away with a miracle fix, but we did create something new. We agreed on a model that actually made sense for both of us. From now on, we would each pay for our own meals, and for any shared items, we'd split the cost only if it felt right to both of us. If I planned a date, I'd pay for the parts that aligned with my values, no guilt, no tension. If he invited me out, he would choose whether to keep things neutral or pay for his own meat. And we came up with something unexpected. We decided to have monthly vegetarian dinners together, cooked at home or discovered in restaurants. Not because I wanted to convert him, and not because he felt pressured to compromise, but because we both wanted a way to explore something meaningful to me, together. Without judgment, without rules. Just curiosity and mutual respect. We didn't break up. That park conversation could have easily been the end of us, but instead, it turned out to be something else, a reckoning. A necessary shift. It forced us to confront who we really were and what we were willing to stand for. It made us take off the masks we'd been wearing, the ones that smiled through disappointment or cracked jokes to avoid tension. It wasn't perfect. It won't be. There will always be things we don't see eye to eye on. But now I know that John is capable of more than just saying he respects me, he can actually show it. Not in dramatic gestures or carefully worded apologies, but in the way he chooses to stop pushing when he knows the line has been drawn. In the way he listens, adjusts, and acts. And for me, that's what real growth looks like. Not the absence of conflict, but the ability to face it without betraying yourself. And I seriously started thinking about whether this couple has a future at all.